Our story of Lincolnshire begins nearly 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. As the ice disappeared, it uncovered rich, fertile soil which attracted a growing community of pioneers, and what we know as rural Lincolnshire was born. Throughout the ages, Lincolnshire's rich farming land has attracted successive groups of invaders and settlers. Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans have all left their mark on the county today. The first of these invaders were the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago. When entering the area, they would have encountered the native Celtic people of the Corinthi tribe. These Iron Age people occupied a territory that included Lincolnshire, parts of Northamptonshire, Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire. The landscape would have been much different than the one we see today. The area known as the Fens, from Skegness on the North Sea coast to Sleaford inland, then south to Peterborough and Ely, and back to the Wash at King's Lynn, was an area comprising of some 400 square miles. The Romans, with their genius for civil and military engineering, were the first to recognise the importance of the rich fertility of the soil of the Fens. They also recognised that without drainage, it was useless land. The Romans built a drainage system that ran for 76 miles through Lincolnshire, from the River Cam in Cambridgeshire to join the River Witham, a few miles east of Lincoln. This drainage system would then act as a catchwater to stop upland water from flowing into the Fens each winter. This catchwater was known as the Cardyke. From the Cardyke to the main rivers across the region, the Romans built cuts or drains to help get the water off the fields and into these rivers. It was a good attempt, but even so, they didn't try to get into the Fens beyond these great rivers. The Romans only drained the bit they were interested in, and that was the stretch of land close to their main roads to Lincoln, namely King Street and Ermine Street. In Lincolnshire there are a number of important Roman roads acting as communication links between settlements, such as Exeter and Lincoln, and London and York. Running from Exeter to Lincoln, the Fossway connected the Colonia at Lincoln to Leicester, the capital of the Corinthi tribe. Running from London to York, Ermine Street passed through Lincolnshire en route to Lincoln. Known locally as the Hydyke, it follows the course of the Lincoln Edge. Of the 4 Roman legions that were included in the conquest, it was the 9th Legion from southwest Hungary and Slovenia that was responsible for the advance north through Lincolnshire. They constructed a number of temporary forts along Ermine Street during the initial push northwards. The parish of Ancaster has been a focus for permanent human settlement since the Iron Age. Therefore, when the Romans' forces reached Ancaster in the early years, a thriving settlement was already in place. There are a number of reasons why Ancaster was a good place to settle. There were a number of water sources, which included natural springs and a beck, a tributary of the River Slee. Also, the silty loam soils of the area were fertile and drained easily, making it perfect for early farming techniques. The Romans soon set up a marching camp in the village. It was 28 acres in size and was one of a number of temporary forts constructed along Ermine Street during the initial push northwards by the 9th Legion. Their headquarters was in the legionary fortress in Lincoln, and the 20 Roman miles between the two towns was considered a reasonable day's march for a soldier. The city of Lincoln occupies a rugged hilltop rising 200 feet above the River Witham. In earliest times, the Celtic tribesmen called their settlement Linden, the hill fort by the pool, and later it was changed to Linden Colonia, from which the name Lincoln was derived. Excavations show that the first Romans maintained a garrison here, from which to pivot their forces for the control of eastern England, The river also functioned as a main artery through which flowed the trade that brought prosperity to the whole community. Two major Roman roads, the Fossway and Ermine Street, met in Lincoln, and the commanding position of the Colonia on top of the hill made it an important location, and the Roman city could only be entered by the four gates. Part of one of them survives to this day. Newport Arch, the northern gateway at the end of Bale Gate. What survives today is the inner wall of the gateway, but it is the oldest archway in England, still in use by traffic on a daily basis. More wall can be seen at the back of Eastgate Hotel. The Mint Wall is one of the best surviving examples of a Roman building in Britain. Thought to be the rear wall of a Roman town hall, it is over 20 metres long and 6 metres high. The Roman southern gateway stood in the High Street on the present-day site of the Stone Bow, which is a medieval replacement. Richard II ordered the rebuilding of the original Roman gate in 1390, but the work was not finished until 1520. The Stoneboat Gateway consists of a central carriageway with small archways either side for pedestrians. At the front, on the south side, the main archway is flanked by two figures set in recesses. They are, on the left, the Virgin Mary, patron saint of the city. On the right, Archangel Gable. Over the main arch are the arms of James I, commemorating his visit to Lincoln in 1617. Since the 16th century, the ground on the first floors have been used for local traders, while the whole of the second floor is occupied by the Guild Hall. On the battlement roof is a moat bell, dating 1387. It is still rung to summon council meetings. It is believed to be the oldest moat bell in Britain. But it was to be the Norman invasions whose influence made Lincoln one of the most important cities in the realm. Steephill is a cobble lane whose gradient is so demanding that a handrail is provided for those who need it. Steephill leads to the splendours of uphill Lincoln, where small shops line the street and where some of the oldest houses are in the county. The domestic architecture of the period is splendidly represented by a building around 1170 and is known as the Jew's House. This fine example of a Norman house construction serves today as a shop and is noted for its superb decorated doorway and chimney above. Close by on the east side of Steephill is Norman House, a well-preserved building dating from the period when Lincoln was at the highest of its wool-based prosperity. It is said to be the oldest inhabitable house in England. As though forgotten by time, the area on Steephill is surrounded by its own historical and architectural wonders. Lincoln Castle was founded by William the Conqueror in 1068. His purpose, like that of his predecessors, was to create an invulnerable stronghold. Even today, the battlement castle walls inspire the awe of the beholder. According to Doomsday, 166 properties were destroyed in order to form the site. The area is about 6 acres in size. The walls varied from 8 to 10 feet in thickness and double this in height. The 14th century Cobb Hall was a place of punishment. The iron rings to which prisoners were fastened are still to be seen in the wall. and the roof was used for hangings until 1868. The old prison, built on the Castle Green enclosure in 1787 and was later enlarged by the Victorians. The chapel in the old prison, where worshippers were ordered in one at a time and compelled to occupy narrow enclosed pews which prevented them from seeing their companions, made standing impossible. Within the passage of the castle gateway is all that's left of the Eleanor Cross. This was the first of the famous crosses erected to mark the halting places of the wife of Edward I. The bust of King George III once stood on Dunstan Pillar. The 30-metre high pillar was surmounted by an octangular lantern. It was erected in 1751 by Sir Francis Dashwood as a land lighthouse to guide travellers across the desolated expanse of the heath. It was said to be Britain's only land lighthouse. Lincoln Cathedral is without doubt the most outstanding piece of architecture in the British Isles. Lincoln Cathedral is the third largest in England, exceeded only by York Minster and St Paul's, and it stands in an area of about 57,000 square feet. In 1072, William the Conqueror appointed Bishop Remigius to the vast diocese sweeping from the Humber in the north to the Thames, and directed him to build the new cathedral. By 1092 the work was done, and the great church, some 325 feet long, dominated the crown of Lincoln Hill. A disastrous fire in 1141 resulted in major reconstruction being carried out by the third bishop, Alexander the Magnificent, who greatly enriched the stonework and added to the height of the existing west towers. More changes were to follow, for in 1185 an earthquake devastated the structural bulk of the cathedral. A year later, a Carthusian monk, Hugh of Avalon, became bishop, and it was he who in 1192 began the immense task of rebuilding in early English style the noble edifice which has endured to this day as the glorious triple-tower cathedral church of St Mary. During the 13th century, the paths and lanes around the cathedral precinct became a notorious haunt of robbers and murderers, and in 1285 Bishop Oliver Sutton obtained permission from King Edward I to build a wall 3.6 metres high to protect the precinct, thus creating the cathedral close. Some stretches of the wall still survive. Of the 5 main gates, only 2 still stand, Exchequer Gate and another at Pottergate. Pottergate Arch, the southern entrance to the cathedral close, is now isolated in a traffic island. Most Anglo-Saxon churches were built of wood and have not survived, but Lincolnshire boasts a great wealth of late Anglo-Saxon church architecture. One of these is St Mary le Wigford. It's a typical late Anglo-Saxon tower with a tall round-headed doorway and a double belfry window divided by a round pillow. But the most unusual feature is the inscribed stone set in the tower to the right of the doorway. It is a Roman tombstone commemorating Caesar, the son of Brucus, probably found on the site where the church was built, for a Roman cemetery lies beneath the building. Another example of Anglo-Saxon architecture is at Harmston. People have worshipped at All Saints' Church at Harmston for over 900 years. The 11th century Anglo-Saxon tower is the earliest part of the church, being constructed by Anglo-Saxon masonries probably after the Norman conquest. Further south is the remains of the Knights Templar at Templar. It was founded in the mid-12th century and, like many monasteries, would have been made up of religious, domestic and farm buildings. The only surviving building is one of a pair of towers which stood at the east of the church. The Knights Templar was an order of soldier monks formed in 1118 during the aftermath of the First Crusade. Their main function was to protect pilgrims on the road to the Holy Land. The part of Sleaford we know today was known as New Sleaford. It was developed during the Saxon period, and by the time of the Norman conquest, the town was already an established administration centre for the region. The town of Sleaford lays on the banks of the River Flee. The New Slee is believed to be a man-made channel to provide power for Anglo-Saxon watermills. This part of the Flee may have been the birthplace of the watermill, and in those days the watermill was at the cutting edge of technology. At the time of the Domesday Book, there were no less than 18 watermills along the banks of the River Flee. Most of them were in Sleaford itself. Congsford Mill is the only surviving watermill in Sleaford. Although the present-day mill was built in the early 18th century, millers have produced flour on this site for over 1,000 years. Sleaford Castle to the southwest of the town was erected by Alexander, Bishop of Lincoln, between 1123 to 1139. The site lies bare now, with only a few mounds remaining. The castle was built as a secure fortress, as Alexander felt under threat from King Stephen. The castle never came under any armed attack. On his return after losing his army and treasure in the Wash, King John took refuge here in 1216 on his final journey to Newark, where he died. It is claimed that he died of poison administered to him by the monks of Swineshead Abbey. Bourne is a red brick town on the foot of the limestone hills of Kirkstead and on the edge of the fens. Bourne has been a settlement since the Roman invasion for its fresh water supply at St. Peter's Pool. Red Hall, a fine Elizabethan manor, stands near the centre of the town, originally owned by the Digby family. Bourne Abbey Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, founded in 1138, on the site of an 8th century Saxon church. The abbey is one of the oldest buildings in Bourne. In the 1st century AD, the Romans arrived at what is now Horncastle and found an undefeated Iron Age settlement laying on the south of the present-day town. During the late 3rd or early 4th century, the Romans built a walled 5-acre fort around the present-day town centre. Today, a few sections of this wall still remain visible above ground. The wall was originally over 4 metres wide and built of Spilsby sandstone. The big question is, why did the Romans bother to fortify a site of Horncastle towards the end of the 3rd century when they had already been in the country for more than 200 years? The answer may stem from the Wash having been much larger at the time, and Horncastle was only a few miles up the River Bain from the shore. Around the beginning of the 4th century, the east coast of Britain was experiencing a few attacks by raiders from across the North Sea. Horncastle was famous for its horse fairs, when traders came from all over the country to strike deals. The present-day Horncastle has become the capital for antiques in the East. The collapse of the Roman rule in this region, as elsewhere in Britain, was gradual. But in 407 AD, the armies were withdrawn from Britain and replaced with about 430 new mercenary troops. Within 15 years, the Saxons had revolted, and their new arrivals from northern Germany and lower countries entered Lincolnshire in the 5th and 6th centuries. During this period, many monasteries were built, but after years of raids on the east coastal areas of England, the Danes now occupied half of Lincolnshire. The monasteries built during that time were destroyed in the 9th century by the Danes. In 850, Crowland Abbey was destroyed by the Danes, and the abbot was killed at the altar. In 866, it was rebuilt and burnt down again in 1010. A third fire in 1091 demolished the abbey buildings along with the library, which was found in 946 and contained over 700 manuscripts. In one corner of a crossroads in the centre of Crowland is a curious triangular bridge. Built around 1360, its original function was to serve as a footbridge at the point of where the River Welland divides into two. Nowadays the water flows under the bridge through sewer channels. The carved figure on the bridge represents Christ holding the world. It was originally on the west front of the abbey. Kirkstead Abbey was founded in 1139. All that remains of the abbey above ground is a corner of the southeast wall of the tower. The monks of the abbey were no great scholars, but they were excellent businessmen when it came to agricultural and horticultural practices. Like many other abbeys along the Witham, they created their own wealth from trading in local wool. The farming methods in those days were called rig and fower. The land was divided into manageable portions and always ploughed to the centre of the highest ground, leaving a ditch either side for holding water for irrigation. The small church of St Leonard's is only a short distance from Kirkstead Abbey. It was founded around 1200. Abbey churches were not normally used or were out of bounds to locals. The effects of the Danes of the history of the area is still seen today in names of over 250 villages in the area. Villages named with ing, by and thorp were villages named by the Danes. Thorp, for instance, means secondary settlement. The whole area occupied by the Danes was known as Danelaw. In Danish times, Stamford was selected capital of the Fens, and in the late 10th century it became one of 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, along with Derby, Leicester, Lincoln and Nottingham. By the time of the Doomsday in 1086, Stamford was classed as a royal borough, with no overlords other than the king. With a total population of some 2,000 to 3,000, there was about 412 mansions in 5 wards north of the River Welland, making Stamford the second largest town in East Midlands after Lincoln. By the late 13th century, Stamford's population had increased to 5,000 to 6,000, and the town's new wealth came mainly from wool and grain. Much of the area around Stamford amassed whose sheep herds. Stamford was one of the 10 biggest urban areas in England. During this period, the town had 4 churches. By the end of the following century, Stamford had 14 parish churches, which only testifies to the town's wealth. The oldest building in Stamford is a ruined chapel of St Leonard's Priory, founded in the 7th century by Alfred, Bishop of York. The existing remains in the grounds of Priory Farm date from about 1082. The Meadows of Stamford is an area of peaceful parkland adjacent to the River Welland. The bridge across the river was originally a 10th century wooden construction, but was replaced with stone in the 12th century. This paved the way for the Great North Road, which ran through Stamford, bringing trade, travellers and wealth. By the 19th century, the medieval bridge was considered the narrowest, most dangerous nuisance between London and Edinburgh. Thus, the Triple Arch Bridge seen today opened in May 1849. As road conditions into Stamford improved, so the numbers of travellers and visitors passing through it increased. St Mary's Street on the Great North Road was an area noted for its inns. During the 18th century, the George and Angel was one of Stamford's most famous coaching inns, and by the end of the 18th century, over half of Stamford coaches stopped here. A sinister reminder of Stamford's past stretches across the road. The gallows, which serves as a reminder to highwaymen and dishonest travellers in bygone times. Groups of almshouses were founded all about the town by rich wool merchants. The best preserved is Brown's Hospital in Broad Street, still in use. It was founded in 1483 by William Brown, a local wool merchant. The Browns were the most prominent family in Stamford, wealthy wool merchants who were also members of the wool stable at Calais. The Browns had so much influence in the town, they rebuilt most of All Saints' Church in the 1470s and 80s. Daniel Lampart, noted for his immense bulk, is buried in the churchyard of St Martin's near the gateway of Burley Park. When he died on the 21st of June 1809, aged 39, his enormous body weight was 52 stones, 11 pounds. Tattershall Castle was the work of Ralph Cromwell, Lord High Treasurer under Henry VI. This magnificent medieval red brick tower and a landmark of the Fens which can be seen for miles around. This 14th century fortress house, now in the care of the National Trust, is a splendid example of medieval brick buildings. Tattershall is a busy village of some 2,500 inhabitants, situated between the fens and the wolds of Lincolnshire, roughly in the centre of the county. Historically, Tattershall was a self-sufficient farming community with a wide range of rural services necessary for the local population. Tattershall also boasts a large parish church, Holy Trinity, which is next to the castle. Ralph Cromwell rebuilt the church and also founded the college. Inside can be found the grave of Tom Thumb. The Middle Ages covers a period of over 400 years, from 1066 to 1500, during which the landscape, already shaped in prehistoric and Roman times, was developed into something very near its present form. The fens had already been partly drained, and many parts of the county were farmed. Existing villages were brought under the authority of lords of the manor. New villages were created, castles and churches were built, and monasteries were founded. The result is a landscape rich in medieval remains of every description. William the Conqueror, in fear that the land would once again fall to foreign invaders, created the first census in 1086. It was called the Domesday Survey, and the results were published in the Domesday Book, which survives to this day. Market Deeping is regarded as a gateway to Lincolnshire from the south. In 1836, Market Deeping was a pickup point for several stagecoach routes. It never had its own service based in the town. The express called here as it galloped between London and Barton and Humber. The King's Head has gone from the marketplace, but the Bull Inn remains, with an odd inn sign showing Crowland Abbey and a parchment. Church Street is regarded as one of the prettiest in Lincolnshire, with its old stone buildings on either side. Many date back to the 17th century. Near to the church is the old rectory, reputed to be the oldest inhabited parsonage in England. The picturesque village of Deeping St James nestles on the banks of the River Welland. The Priory Church of St James was founded here in 1139, and in the village centre is a small listed building which was once the village market cross, converted into the local lockup for drunks in 1819. There was just enough room inside for 3 people. Gainsborough, on the eastern bank of the River Trent, was Britain's most inland port. Being an important wool centre in the Middle Ages, a new part of the town grew alongside the church. The town flourished around the market framework, with the early timber frame buildings being replaced by red brick that now characterise the town. Only the old hall survives from the age of timber. The old hall is a magnificent 15th century manor house, was owned by only 2 families until given to the nation in 1970. This timber frame building was built between 1460 and 1480. It welcomed King Richard III in 1483 and Henry VIII in 1541. Henry VIII stayed here for 4 days with his 5th wife Catherine Howard. The building holds strong connections with the Mayflower Pilgrims, as Sir William Hickman, Lord of the Manor, allowed separatists to worship secretly in the manor house. North of Gainsborough is a village rich in natural charm. Alkborough stands on the high cliff ridge overlooking Trent Falls and the Yorkshire border, at the point where the Ouse and the Trent become the Humber. Julian's Bower, a 44-foot maze cut in turf, is believed to have been made in the 12th century by monks. A plan of this maze can be seen on the floor in the church porch. In the churchyard is a curious stone standing about 5 feet high, worn down by sharpening swords and arrowheads. William Storr, vicar of Market Rasen, was murdered in 1602 by Francis Cartwright, who was the only son of the lord of the manor. Cartwright believed a sermon of Storr's was an attack on him, so at 8 o'clock one morning, Cartwright killed the vicar with his sword. The name of this street gives some indication of when it was built, and reminds us that Copenhagen, the horse which Wellington rode at Waterloo, was possibly born here at Market Rasen. Medieval Lincolnshire was divided into 3 areas: Holland, Kesteven and Lindsey, each with distinct administrative, geographical and agricultural characters. The early part of this period was generally prosperous, and great quantities of wool, much of which was produced by abbeys and priories. Another was salt, which was exported to the continent through Lindsey and Holland ports. Principal among these was Boston. A settlement in Boston can be traced back to 645 AD, when Botolph established a monastery on the banks of the River Witham. The name Boston is thought to be a corruption of St. Botolph's town, and its early associations with this Anglo-Saxon monk, whose history is shadowy, but whose relics are spread as far as Denmark and Norway. There are 80 churches dedicated to him in England, but Boston is the most famous. Boston's history really started after the Battle of Hastings, and the main settlement of Boston was around the bridge across the Witham. The marketplace and streets were linked with shops and workshops. There are references to craftsmen, such as gold and coppersmiths, and during the fire of 1288, it is alleged that the heat was so intense, molten gold and silver ran through the streets. Boston's international trade flourished, and the port was alive with foreign merchants and sailors. By the 1280s, a third of all wool exported from England went out of Boston. Around 3 million fleeces were exported annually at the end of the 13th century, and there were nearly 2 million litres of wine coming in, making Boston a very busy port. The most visible symbol of its trading wealth is the beautiful St. Botolph's Church, its tower known to all as the Stump. The 272 feet high church is visible for miles around and serves as a valuable guide to travellers both on land and sea. The church was built during the 14th century, largely from the proceeds of the trade in wool, as were many of the fine stone churches in the Wolds and Fens. The present church seems to be the 4th built on this site, the oldest portion being the lowest part of the tower. The first stone which was laid on Monday, June the 30th, 1309, but it wasn't completed for another 200 years later. The church contains memory of 5 men from Boston who became governors of Massachusetts. Also George Bass and Joseph Banks, both of whom sailed with Captain Cook to Australia. Such was the wealth of the guilds, by 1450 they were able to pay for the building of the Guild Hall, which was described as the finest building in Boston. The original Pilgrim Fathers were tried in the Guildhall courtroom and imprisoned in the cells below. Close to the Guildhall is more evidence of Boston's 18th century prosperity. Fidel House, built by an unknown architect in 1726, and it was originally built as William Fidel's handsome in-town residence. In Spain Lane is the remains of a 13th century rectory of the Dominican Friary, converted in 1965 to become Blackfriars Art Centre and Theatre. One of the most spectacular features in the town is the Maud Foster's Mill, the tallest working mill in the country. The mill lies just beyond Bargate Green. Unusually, it has 5 sails or sweeps. Built in 1819 to grind corn brought in by barge along the Maud Foster's drain, it is still producing homegrown flour today. Grantham is an ancient market town believed to have originated from a 6th century Saxon settlement. Its Saxon name is said to mean the settlement on the gravel. During the Viking invasions in the 8th and 9th century, all the best land around Grantham was owned by the Saxons. The Vikings had no other choice but on the hills surrounding Grantham. These included Barrowby, Harrowby and Somerby. Grantham is situated midway between London and York along the Great North Road. It became a preferred stopping point for noblemen and kings who used the inns as they journeyed through by stagecoach. The Angel and Royal Hotel was evidence of this era. Chosen as the court by King John, it is said to be one of the oldest inns in England and lays claim to having more historical interest than some stately homes. The Angel, as it was originally called, was built 800 years ago for the Knights Templars, on the land belonging to the Knights of Temple Brewer. The priory on the north side of the marketplace was once thought to be the remains of a Franciscan friary of Grantham, dating back to the early 1700s. The visible focus point of the town centre must be Grantham's Guildhall, a grand Victorian building designed by William Watkins, built between 1867 and 1869. With its distinct clock tower, the building commands an impressive position on St. Peter's Hill at the top end of the High Street. Grantham was the second place in which the Eleanor Cross was erected. It was destroyed in the Civil War. There now stands a monument to Grantham's most famous son, Sir Isaac Newton, standing before the Guildhall on St. Peter's Hill. Isaac Newton was the world's most famous scientist, born on Christmas Day on 1642 at Woolthorpe by Colesworth, 6 miles from Grantham. Isaac's father, a prosperous Lincolnshire farmer, had died 2 months before he was born. Isaac remained at Woolthorpe and spent an introverted and isolated childhood in the care of his grandmothers. He was educated at Grantham's grammar school, and in 1661 Isaac Newton left Lincolnshire to continue his studies at Cambridge. However, in 1665 and 1666 he was forced to return to his birthplace at Woolthorpe to escape the plague. It was at Woolthorpe Manor that Isaac Newton formed 3 great discoveries, and one of these was the law of gravity. The apple orchard in front of the house contains an old apple tree, which may be grafted from the famous tree which inspired Newton to formulate the law of gravitation. The apple tree has been identified by Kew Gardens as a very old species called Flower of Kent. Isaac Newton was voted Man of the Millennium by the Sunday Times. Catlin's Bakery and Restaurant, a Tudor building which has stood in Grantham's High Street since at least 1560. It is situated on the site of the original bakery where Grantham's gingerbread was first made. St Wulfran's, magnificent cathedral-like church in Swinegate, probably Grantham's most famous architectural site. The church has been proclaimed as a second only to Salisbury Cathedral in beauty, while its steeple is the sixth largest in England. The mere sight of the 281 feet spire was supposedly enough to make John Ruskin faint. The spire of St Wulfran's was the first of the great spires of England when built between 1280 and 1300. Originally built in the Anglo-Saxon period in 720 and dedicated to St Wulfran, a 7th century missionary. Westgate Hall was built as a corn exchange in 1852, the same year as the Great Northern Railway came to Grantham. Grantham was one of the last significant English towns to join the network in the 19th century. Grantham was strengthened its position as a trading post and a place where people and goods were bound to pass through. Today, Grantham is at the centre of the rail hub that connects the main East Coast line between London and Scotland. The lines run east and west across the country. Couple that with the excellent road links provided by the A1 and the A52 makes Grantham a major player in trade and tourism. Belton House is constructed of fine Ancaster stone, built in a little more than 2 years from the first stone being laid in March 1685. The honey-coloured stone mansion is located just north of Grantham. Belton House is a National Trust property, set in 1,000 acres of wooded deer park and landscaped gardens. The Brownlows and Cuss family have had a long association with Belton House. They were descendants of a wealthy Elizabethan lawyer who bought the estate in 1617. Spalding grew up beside the River Welland and was a place of importance by Norman times, with a castle which no trace remains. In 1710, the Gentlemen's Society of Spalding was formed by Maurice Johnson, who had 26 children, and all by one wife. The Johnsons' family house was the beautiful late medieval Afcaffey Hall. Regency and Victorian alterations to the original 1420s design have made Afcaffey Hall a wonderful mixture of architectural styles. Afcaffey Hall and the 5-acre wall garden was originally designed as a self-supporting site for the families that owned it. The household would have enjoyed fresh fruit and vegetables from the kitchen gardens and orchards. The Spalding Church of St Mary and St Nicholas was built as a parish church by the Spalding Priory. It was started in 1284 by Prior William de Littleport and finished by a successor, Prior Clement Hadfield. In 1782, a weather clock was placed on the steeple by William Cross. That night he celebrated his brave deed by getting drunk in one of the local inns, after which he fell into the River Welland and drowned. Spalding retains many of its fine buildings, which include in the marketplace the White Hart, which has been an inn for hundreds of years. Mary Queen of Scots stayed for a night in 1566, and William Lee was killed here in a duel in 1723. With its narrow winding streets and old inns, Louth is an old market town, and it's justifiably called capital of the Wolds. Although Roman and Anglo-Saxon remains have been found in the area, the main interest concentrates on St James's Church, one of the finest perpendicular style churches of its kind. Built in the 15th century, it is the tallest parish church in England, with a spire that soars to 300 feet and can be seen for miles around. Louth took a prominent part in the Lincolnshire Rising in 1536. The result was that several of the townsmen were put to death at Louth, and the vicar, Thomas Kendall, was hanged at Tyne. On Saturday the 29th of May 1920, one of the worst storms the area had ever seen hit Louth. Over 4.5 inches of rain fell within a 22 square mile catchment area of the River Ludd, just west of Louth. The town of Louth stood in the path of some 8 million tons of water pouring off the Wolds. The dam of Little Welton gave way. A wall of water some 14 feet high swept towards the town. It was a disaster which immediately hit the national headlines. 50 houses destroyed beyond repair, and another 250 needed rebuilding, with a further 500 damaged by floodwater. 800 people were made homeless. And finally, what better way to finish than with Lincolnshire's greatest poet? The bronze statue of Alfred Tennyson was sculptured by his friend G.F. Watts and set in the lawns of Ministers Green in 1905. Alfred Tennyson was a great Victorian poet, the son of an Anglican clergyman. He was born at what is now Somerby House in 1809. Tennyson is recognised for the lines "The Miller's Daughter," and anyone who knows the Lincolnshire Wolds will recognise the setting at Stockwith Mill, a place the poet knew well when he was a young man. Today, much of the landscape and lifestyle of Lincolnshire has changed. It's not quite as wild as it was when Henry VIII referred to it as the most brute and beastly shire in his kingdom. The pace of life and tranquility of Lincolnshire is a typical example of real England. It is so rich in history and heritage, with a wealth of historic houses, gardens and castles nestling amidst picturesque villages, ancient market towns and scenic countryside, with rolling hills that give way to peaceful fertile fens in the east.